That morning, Nathan Hayes fired his housekeeper in under 3 minutes. No explanations requested, no reasons given. A small cloth bag, bread, leftover rice, a couple of apples was all the evidence he needed. To him, the act was straightforward. Taking what didn't belong to you was stealing no matter how little it was worth. Claire Bennett walked out of the mansion without a single word, clutching that bag tight against her chest, her eyes fixed straight ahead. But the person watching every moment of it from the top of the curved staircase wasn't Nathan. It was Sadie, his 9-year-old daughter. And by the next morning, she was gone. Nathan Hayes had built his life the same way he built his business, precisely, efficiently, and without room for error. At 42, he ran one of the most respected real estate development firms in the Pacific Northwest, with 3 regional offices, over 200 employees, and a reputation for being the kind of man who delivered exactly what he promised, nothing more, nothing less. People who worked with him respected that. Some admired it. Most kept a comfortable distance, which Nathan had always found perfectly acceptable. The divorce from Rebecca had been finalized 3 years ago, and the custody battle that followed had been, as Nathan once described it to his attorney, the most expensive education of his adult life. Rebecca was sharp-polished and knew precisely how to present herself in a courtroom, which was her attorney had pointed out repeatedly more than could be said for a man who traveled 2 weeks out of every month and consistently put his phone on the dinner table. The first judge had seen enough. Nathan came home one October afternoon to find a court order on the kitchen counter and a suitcase by the door. He got Sadie on weekends and every other holiday. Rebecca got everything else. It took another year of legal filings, character references, and one very well-documented account of Rebecca's extended absence during Sadie's hospitalization for appendicitis before a second judge revised the arrangement. Nathan got full custody. Rebecca got scheduled visitation rights she used sporadically, and Sadie got a father who was suddenly urgently trying to figure out how to be present in ways that didn't involve spreadsheets or quarterly projections. He was still working on it. Some days went better than others. The house on Whitmore Hill was everything a successful man was supposed to want. High ceilings, hardwood floors, a professionally landscaped garden that stayed immaculate year-round regardless of season. Sadie had her own room at the end of the east wing, painted the pale yellow she had chosen herself at age 6, and never asked to change, with a window seat overlooking the backyard and the old oak tree she had climbed exactly once before Nathan caught her. She filled the room with books, half-finished drawings, and a particular quality of silence that made Nathan uneasy when he passed by at night. Not troubled silence, just interior, like she was always thinking about something no one had thought to ask her about yet. He had hired Claire Bennett 7 months ago through a staffing agency. She had come with solid references, a clean background check, and the kind of straightforward work ethic that didn't require managing. She showed up before 7, completed every task without prompting, and didn't try to fill the house with unnecessary conversation. Nathan had been through 3 housekeepers in the 2 years prior, one who gave unsolicited parenting advice with impressive consistency, one who broke a lamp and lied about it twice, and one who left without notice the week before Thanksgiving. Claire had been, until that Friday morning, exactly what the household needed. The morning it happened, Nathan had come downstairs earlier than usual. A conference call with his Singapore partners had come in before dawn, and by 6:15, he was already showered, dressed, and moving toward the coffee maker when he stopped. Claire was standing at the far counter near the pantry, her back to him, wrapping something in a dish towel and sliding it carefully into a small cloth bag, the reusable kind, sold at grocery checkout lanes. She folded the top of the bag, closed, reached for her jacket draped over the nearest chair, and turned around to find Nathan 4 feet away, watching her without expression. The look on her face in that moment told him everything he believed he needed to know. She went still in the particular way people do when a door they assumed was closed turns out to be wide open. Nathan looked at the bag. He looked at Claire. He set his coffee mug down on the counter slowly and told her in the measured tone he used for delivering decisions that were already final, that her employment in this household was ending effective immediately, that her last paycheck would be processed through the agency by the following Wednesday, and that she had 20 minutes to collect her personal belongings from the staff room. Claire opened her mouth. Whatever she had intended to say, she reconsidered it and closed her mouth again. She nodded. Once a single deliberate dip of the chin reached for her jacket and walked to the staff room without another word. She did not put down the cloth bag. Nathan noticed, but said nothing. 18 minutes later, she walked down the front path and through the iron gate without slowing or looking back. Nathan stood at the kitchen window until she disappeared around the bend in the road. Then he poured his coffee, sat at the table, pulled up his morning briefing, and had answered 6 emails before 7 o'clock. He did not think about Claire Bennett again until dinner, when Sadie pushed her food around the plate for nearly 10 minutes, and then set her fork down with the careful, deliberate precision of a child who has been rehearsing a conversation since at least lunchtime. "She didn't steal it," Sadie said. Nathan looked up from his phone. Sadie was watching him with the patient, unblinking steadiness she had been deploying since she learned it worked better than arguing. "Claire," she continued, "she didn't steal it. She never eats lunch here, Dad, not once in 7 months. I noticed because I always come down for a snack around noon on school days, and she was always in the kitchen, but never eating anything. I asked her once, and she said she wasn't very hungry, but I could tell she was." Sadie picked up her fork, held it for a second, and set it back down. "I just thought you should know that part." Nathan told her to finish her dinner. Sadie ate 3 more bites, asked to be excused, and went upstairs. He sat alone at the long table for another 20 minutes, eating without tasting anything, and telling himself that the reason behind the act was irrelevant. He had established clear household policies for a reason. Exceptions led to other exceptions. He had not built what he had built by making exceptions, and he was not going to start now. He went to bed at 11, certain of this. By 6 the next morning, Sadie was gone. The note on her pillow said, in the rounded, careful cursive of a child who had learned it the previous spring, "I went to find out the truth." Sadie. Nathan stood in the doorway of the yellow room and read those 8 words 3 times. Then he was moving phone already in hand, dialing Sadie's cell first, then his head of security, then his driver, then both neighbors within a half-mile radius. He stood in the driveway in the early morning cold coat thrown over his work clothes, the note folded in his left hand, and felt something he had not felt since the night he first read that custody order 3 years ago. The specific gutting recognition of exactly how much you stand to lose when you have spent too long assuming everything is fine. Claire's home address was on file with the staffing agency. Nathan had it within 15 minutes. He typed it into the GPS and pulled out of the gate before his morning housekeeper arrived for the shift. The city changed as he drove east. Whitmore Hill's wide oak-canopied streets gave way to narrower roads and older storefronts, then to the kind of neighborhood that had been on the receiving end of city revitalization promises for 2 decades, without seeing much revitalization. He found Garfield Street, and the address, a narrow 2-story row house, with a cheerful blue front door that looked like someone had painted it years ago in a deliberate act of optimism. Nathan parked half a block away and walked the rest, his dress shoes loud on the cracked sidewalk. He found the door slightly open and knocked anyway. Sadie was inside, sitting cross-legged on worn linoleum between a small girl with tangled red hair and a boy close to her own age, all 3 of them bent over a hand-drawn map of something. Claire stood at a narrow kitchen counter, ladling cereal into bowls. A second smaller boy sat on a step stool beside her, watching the bowls fill with the focused attention of someone who has learned not to assume food will always be there. Claire turned, saw Nathan, and the color left her face immediately. Sadie looked up at her father with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who had completed the task she had set out to accomplish and was prepared to deal with whatever came next. "This is Tommy," she said, gesturing to the boy beside her. "He's 8. That's Lily. She's 6. And that's Owen on the stool. He's 4, and he doesn't talk much anymore. Their parents died in a car accident last October." She said this with the plain, factual directness children sometimes use for things they have recently learned are true and are still deciding how to feel about. Claire is their sister. She's been taking care of all 3 of them by herself since then. Nathan stood in the doorway and looked at the 3 children. He looked at the cereal box on the counter store, brand nearly empty, and at the refrigerator, whose door-mounted list of emergency numbers was the only decoration on its surface. He looked at the cloth bag hanging on a hook beside the door. A loaf of bread was tucked inside it, and 2 apples, and what appeared to be a small container of leftover rice. The same bag, the same food. He had fired her over a bag of food meant for children who had no one else. He drove Sadie home without saying much. She didn't push him, which told him she understood he needed time to rearrange something inside himself. He spent that Saturday in his home office without opening his laptop a single time, which had not happened on a weekend since the year after the divorce. What he had seen on Garfield Street had moved into the space between his ribs and was not going anywhere. 3 children who had lost their parents. A 26-year-old woman stretching whatever she could find to feed them for another day, taking leftover food that was going to be thrown out anyway. And he had fired her for it in 4 sentences without asking a single question. He called the staffing agency that afternoon and asked them to pass along a message he wanted to discuss, reinstating Claire Bennett effective as soon as she was willing. The agency coordinator was professionally diplomatic. Claire, she said, was not immediately available. Nathan left his number and told himself he had done what he could. On Monday morning, his attorney Diane called at 8:50. The call was not about a business matter. Rebecca had retained a new family law attorney, a man named Garrett, who had a reputation for being meticulous and largely unpleasant in equal measure. Garrett had filed a motion to revisit the current custody arrangement on grounds of instability and evidence of erratic decision-making in the home environment. The filing specifically cited the wrongful termination of a household employee and Nathan's minor daughter, leaving the family residence unsupervised at 6 in the morning without the parents' knowledge. Nathan read the motion on his office computer and then called Diane back. "She's had someone watching the house," Diane said without preamble. "Rebecca doesn't file motions. She doesn't expect to win, Nathan. The unsupervised child issue is going to be the centerpiece, Sadie leaving without your knowledge, being gone for nearly an hour, traveling to a neighborhood you weren't familiar with. That's enough to get a judge's serious attention." A pause. "The termination piece is softer, but Garrett will use it to construct a character portrait. Impulsive, rigid, doesn't listen to the people around him. Those are the same words Rebecca's team used 3 years ago, and they almost worked then." Another pause, shorter. "We need a witness who can speak to what actually happened. Someone who was present. Someone credible." Nathan already knew exactly who she meant before she finished the sentence. He went back to Garfield Street on a Tuesday evening, arriving just after 6. Claire opened the door in a paint-stained sweatshirt with a dish towel folded over one shoulder, the look on her face suggesting she had been half expecting this and had spent some time deciding how she felt about it. She let him in. Owen was on the couch under a fleece blanket, already half asleep. Tommy and Lily were doing homework at the kitchen table, Lily mouthing the words of something she was reading. Nathan sat in the single, unoccupied chair. Everything else in the small living area was covered in children's homework or folded laundry, and told Claire clearly and completely what was happening. The motion, the timeline, what Garrett was building, what Diane believed was needed to counter it. Claire listened without interrupting. Nathan had noticed this about her before, and noticed it again. Now she did not jump in, did not react visibly to the parts about Rebecca, or the pending hearing did not perform concern or indignation. She listened completely, and when he finished, she was quiet for several seconds before she spoke. "So you need me to explain what was in the bag and why I took it," she said, "and to say that your visit here was because you were concerned about your daughter and wanted to understand what happened. Not because you were angry with me." Her voice was even without inflection. "That's what you need." "Yes," Nathan said. "That's exactly it." Lily had fallen asleep over her math worksheet. Tommy was watching Nathan with the flat, measuring expression of a boy who had been the responsible one in the room for longer than was reasonable. Claire looked at the table for a long moment before she looked back up, and what she said next was delivered without sharpness or self-pity, simply as information that was relevant and hadn't yet been shared. She told him about the morning he fired her, specifically about the 40 minutes before it, about opening the refrigerator at home at 5:30 and finding half a carton of milk that had expired 2 days prior and nothing else, about Owen running a fever through the night that had finally broken at 3 in the morning, which meant she had been awake since midnight, about the food she had taken: bread, rice, 2 apples, which was going to be discarded that day because the policy in his household kitchen was to clear all perishables by Friday morning before the weekend. She had confirmed this with the KitchenAid a week earlier. She had been building herself up to ask Nathan for permission to take surplus food for 2 weeks, and that morning she had simply run out of time for building up. "I knew it was a gray area," she said. "I should have asked outright before I did it. That part was on me." She folded the dish towel in her hands precisely along its existing creases. "But I didn't take it for myself." Nathan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been. "I should have asked why before I said anything else," he said. "That was the mistake. That one was mine. It was not a speech or a performance. He said it the way someone states a fact they have been sitting with long enough to stop arguing against it." Claire looked at him for a moment, then nodded slowly, the kind of nod that accepts something without pretending it undoes what came before. Nathan told her he would make sure she was compensated for her time regardless of her decision. He stood to leave, and she said she would think about it, and he nodded and let himself out. On the drive home across the darkened city, something in his chest had shifted, not lifted, not resolved, but distributed differently. Less pressing on the part that felt like guilt, more concentrated on something he hadn't felt much of in recent years, which was the tentative, unsettled sensation of hoping something would turn out well. He was still getting used to the feeling when the second problem arrived 3 days later, in the form of a 2-paragraph item in the East Side Courier, a neighborhood paper with a small print run and a surprisingly active community website. A resident of Garfield Street, a woman named Dorothy Hale, retired, who had apparently observed Nathan's car parked half a block from the row house on 2 separate occasions and drawn conclusions she considered newsworthy, had called the paper's community tips line. The resulting piece was brief and carefully worded and entirely clear. In its implication, a wealthy employer, having dismissed a young working-class woman, had obtained her home address and appeared at her residence uninvited on 2 separate occasions within a single week. Garrett's office had a copy by the following morning. By afternoon, it had been attached to a supplemental filing. The framing was the kind of thing that didn't need to be explicitly accusatory to be effective. No criminal allegations, no extreme language, simply a pattern of behavior that suggested poor judgment and a consistent failure to consider how his actions affected others. Nathan, who had in fact visited a former employee's home without invitation on 2 occasions within 7 days, did not have a clean counter-narrative to offer. Diane called him the afternoon the supplemental landed. "I'll be straight with you," she said. This changed things significantly. Garrett is going to argue that everything together, the termination, Sadie leaving unsupervised, the 2 unannounced visits, paints a portrait of someone who reacts without thinking and then tries to manage consequences instead of preventing them. That argument has traction with the right judge. A pause. We need Claire's testimony more than ever, and we need it to be clear and specific, not just about the bag, but about who you were in that room when you sat down and listened to her. The preliminary hearing landed on a Thursday. Claire had told him she would think about it, and 3 days had passed without any contact, and Nathan had made the hard, deliberate choice not to call again. He had asked. He would not ask twice. The least he owed her was a decision made without any pressure from him. On Wednesday evening with Sadie at Rebecca's for the standard weekly arrangement, Nathan sat alone in the house on Whitmore Hill, in a silence that was large and specific to every room he moved through. He ate leftovers standing at the kitchen counter. He walked through the living room twice without sitting down. He stood in the doorway of Sadie's yellow room and looked at the window seat, where she had left a colored pencil drawing on the cushion, 3 children and an older girl, standing outside a blue door with a figure in the background, watching from a distance. He stood there long enough to understand what she had been drawing and why. He was sitting at his desk at 9:45, not reading the brief open on his screen, when Diane called. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone delivering news that is worse than they had prepared themselves to give. The judge had reviewed the supplemental filing. He was issuing a temporary modification Rebecca would have primary custody, pending the full hearing. Nathan would keep standard visitation. The transfer was scheduled for the following morning. Sadie's school had been notified. Nathan set the phone on the desk and sat without moving. Through the tall office windows, the city lights spread outward in every direction, steady and indifferent in the way city lights always are, when you need them to reflect something back, and they simply do not. He turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a long time. 2 days after the temporary order at 7 in the morning, Nathan was sitting at the kitchen table in front of a cup of coffee he had not touched when he heard a knock at the front door. He opened it to find Claire Bennett on the front step hands, wrapped around a travel mug dark coat buttoned to the collar. At the end of the front path, Tommy stood on the sidewalk with Owen on his back, giving Lily a piggyback that she was slightly too old for, and both of them were thoroughly enjoying. "I heard about the order," Claire said. She looked at him directly without preamble. "Sadie mentioned it to Tommy, and Tommy told me." She paused for exactly a beat. "I've been thinking about what you need me to say, not just about the bag, but about the second time you came to the house. About what you looked like sitting in that chair, listening to me." She glanced briefly at the 3 children at the end of the path, then back at him. "I've had people help me for the wrong reasons, and people help me for the right reasons, and I've gotten reasonably good at telling the difference. That night, you weren't there to protect yourself. You were there because you believed you had done something wrong, and you needed to look at it directly." She paused once more. "That matters, and I'll say so in whatever room they need me to say it in." Nathan held the door for a moment without speaking. The morning was cold, the sky the flat pale gray of early October, and a bird somewhere in the back oak tree was making a sound that seemed, under the circumstances, almost aggressively cheerful. He stepped aside and opened the door fully. "Come in," he said. "I'll make more coffee." For the next hour, the house on Whitmore Hill was something it had not been in a long time. Tommy negotiated permission to examine the backyard oak tree. Lily discovered Sadie's colored pencils on the window seat and asked very carefully whether she might borrow one. Owen sat on the kitchen floor with 3 measuring spoons and the lid of a pot running experiments, whose purpose was not entirely clear. Claire and Nathan sat at the kitchen table and talked not about the hearing, not about strategy, but about the parts of the previous months that neither of them had said out loud to anyone. The period after the divorce, when Nathan had been so entirely focused on proving his capability that he had forgotten to simply ask Sadie whether she was all right. The night Claire had driven home from the hospital at 4 in the morning after her parents were admitted, before they knew how badly and understood for the first time, in the specific dread of that particular hour, that she was now the only responsible adult in the lives of 3 children who had not chosen this any more than she had. Nathan refilled both mugs without asking. Outside, Tommy had climbed to the first large branch of the oak tree and was narrating his progress to Owen at some volume. The full custody hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. Diane filed Claire's formal witness statement the day after her visit, alongside a declaration from the staffing agency confirming that Nathan had initiated reinstatement procedures voluntarily on the Saturday following the termination, before the custody motion had been filed Monday morning, a timeline that Garrett would not be able to reframe convincingly. The agency coordinator had included, without being asked, a brief note of her own. In 9 years of placing household staff, she had never once seen an employer proactively initiate reinstatement without the employee requesting it or a third party intervening. On the morning of the hearing, Nathan arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes early in a charcoal suit he'd had for 5 years. He sat on a wooden bench in the corridor and waited. Garrett and Rebecca arrived at 9:50. Rebecca moving with the composed certainty of someone who had already decided how the afternoon would end. Claire arrived at 9:55 with Diane. She was wearing a dark blue dress Nathan had not seen before, something simple and deliberate, the kind of thing chosen to communicate that the person wearing it deserves to be taken seriously. She sat down beside Nathan on the bench and smoothed the fabric over her knees once, and then left her hands still. Inside the courtroom, the hearing proceeded with the methodical, largely undramatic quality of proceedings, in which the people telling the truth don't have to work hard to keep their stories consistent. Diane presented the timeline in clean, documented sequence. Claire was called to testify. She answered every question directly and without elaboration, describing events the way someone does when they are not constructing a narrative, but simply recalling what happened. She confirmed the contents of the cloth bag and why she had taken it. She confirmed that Nathan had arrived at her residence the first time out of concern for his daughter and had left visibly shaken by what he found. She confirmed the second visit that he had come to her door, alone, had told her clearly that he believed he had acted wrongly, and had then sat in her living room and listened to her account of the previous 7 months without interrupting once or offering a single justification. Garrett cross-examined with characteristic precision, probing for inconsistencies in the sequence of events and suggesting that Claire had a straightforward financial motivation for supporting Nathan's position, given the reinstatement he had offered. Claire considered the question for a moment before answering. He called the staffing agency about reinstatement on Saturday, she said. Rebecca's attorney filed the custody motion on Monday. The order matters. She looked at Garrett with the patient, slightly tired expression of someone who has been underestimated often enough to find it less insulting than tedious. I'm here because his daughter deserves to be at home with a father who is working to be better than he was. That's the only reason I came. The judge asked several clarifying questions. He reviewed the supplemental filings, the original custody record, the documented account of Sadie's hospitalization and Rebecca's absence during it. He recessed for 90 minutes. When he returned, his ruling was 4 sentences. The temporary modification was vacated. Full custody reverted to Nathan Hayes. Effective immediately, Rebecca's visitation schedule remained as previously established, and the matter would be reviewed in 6 months at the court's standard discretion. Nathan sat completely still for a moment after the gavel came down. Diane squeezed his forearm once. Rebecca and Garrett gathered their materials and left without speaking. Nathan turned to say something to Claire and discovered with mild surprise that the words were not immediately available to him, which was not a sensation he experienced often. She was already standing and gathering her things, and she looked up and offered him a small, genuine smile, the uncomplicated kind that asks nothing back. Go get your daughter, she said. Sadie came home on a Friday afternoon, delivered by Rebecca's driver, carrying her school backpack and the small duffel she kept packed for weeks at her mother's house. She walked through the front door, set both bags on the entryway floor, and did a brief, careful survey of the house the way she always did when she had been away, checking whether anything had moved the way people do when they need to confirm that the place they are most attached to has stayed recognizable. Then she went to the kitchen. Claire was at the stove starting dinner. Tommy and Lily were at the table with homework spread between them. Owen was on the floor with the measuring spoons, which had apparently become a permanent installation. Sadie stood in the doorway for 3 or 4 seconds, taking all of it in. Then she pulled out the chair beside Lily, sat down, and started pulling a workbook out of her backpack, as though this were simply the way things were, and always had been, and she was glad to be back to confirm it. Nathan stood in the hallway and watched through the doorway. He didn't go in immediately. He stood there long enough to hear Tommy explain a long division problem to Sadie with the confident, slightly incorrect authority of a boy who has not yet been told he has the wrong method. He stood there long enough to hear Sadie correct him quietly and precisely, and hear Tommy argue back, and hear Lily sigh the specifically weighted sigh of a child who has brothers and has made her peace with it. He went in when Claire asked him to, which was when she needed someone to reach the olive oil from the top shelf. He got it down, and she said thank you. And he said, of course. And he stood at the counter beside her for a moment, watching Owen rearrange the measuring spoons into a configuration that appeared to have architectural ambitions, before pulling out the chair at the head of the table and sitting down. Dinner that night was pasta with jarred marinara that Claire had improved with garlic and fresh basil from the pot on the windowsill. Garlic bread made from a baguette that was slightly past its prime and was better for it, and a green salad that Owen declined to eat, and Nathan didn't make him finish. The table conversation was about Tommy's current school project, which involved constructing a model of the solar system and had generated a substantial disagreement about whether Pluto deserved representation. Sadie had opinions. So did Tommy. The debate continued through the entire main course and was still unresolved at dessert, which was ice cream eaten from the container with serving spoons because no one had thought to buy bowls that week. It was, Nathan reflected, the loudest meal he had eaten in that house in at least 3 years. After dinner, Sadie helped clear the table without being asked, which she had never done before. While Claire washed up at the sink, Nathan sat on the back step with a cup of coffee and watched Tommy demonstrate to Owen the precise technique for catching fireflies, a project complicated significantly by the absence of fireflies in early October, and Tommy's apparent conviction that this was a surmountable obstacle. Owen watched with the solemn, concentrated attention he gave to most things. After a few minutes, Sadie came and sat beside Nathan on the step, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm. She looked at Tommy for a moment. I know you're going to say I shouldn't have left without telling you, she said. Nathan said she shouldn't have. She said she knew. She was quiet for a few seconds. But I needed to find out if you had a reason for being wrong, because sometimes people are wrong for reasons that make sense when you understand them, and sometimes they're just wrong. She watched Owen attempting to replicate Tommy's stalking posture with the grave commitment he brought to all new physical skills. You had a reason. Nathan looked at his daughter, at the cheekbones she had from her mother, and the stubbornness that was entirely his, and the other thing that was just hers, that had been developing in the years when he hadn't been paying close enough attention. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way children do when they are almost old enough to stop doing it and are quietly making the most of the time remaining. Yeah, he said. I had a reason. That doesn't make it right. Sadie nodded. No, she said. But it means it can be fixed. 6 months after the hearing, Nathan established the Hayes Family Foundation, a small, deliberately unglamorous organization that provided food assistance, emergency childcare coordination, and school supply funds for single-parent households across the city's eastern and southern neighborhoods. He held no press event. He issued no press release. He hired a program director, established referral partnerships with 4 local social services offices, and wrote a personal check for the first year of operating costs. Claire Bennett sat on the board. So did Dorothy Hale, the neighbor, who had called the newspaper, who turned out, once Nathan actually met her, to be a retired social worker with 31 years of experience and encyclopedic knowledge of every gap in the city's family services infrastructure, and absolutely no hesitation about sharing her views on all of it. She had attended the Foundation's first board meeting and spoken for 22 of the 60 scheduled minutes. Nathan had found this extremely useful. The Foundation's first community lunch was held on a Saturday in March at a church hall on Garfield Street. 43 families came. Nathan spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen, which had not been where he originally planned to spend it, but someone needed to keep the coffee urns filled, and it turned out he was reasonably good at it. Sadie was there too, at a corner table helping Lily finish a drawing. She had started months earlier, at a window seat in a yellow room. 3 children and an older girl standing outside a blue door with 2 more figures, now added, carefully in the background, standing a little apart, watching from a respectful and appropriate distance. There are things that cannot be learned in a boardroom, or read in a quarterly report, or found in any of the metrics Nathan Hayes had spent 20 years carefully optimizing. They come a different way through a child's handwritten note, left on a pillow, through a cloth bag on a kitchen counter in the early morning light, through the sight of a young woman dividing food between 4 portions when she had barely enough for one doing it without complaint or performance or any expectation of recognition. Some lessons arrive when you are ready for them. Others arrive precisely when you need them, which is almost never the same thing. And some of the most important ones come tucked inside the smallest, most ordinary objects, a bag of bread and apples, nothing more, waiting quietly on a countertop for someone to finally stop long enough to ask why.